grandmother, my mother's side, uh, lived about 3 blocks from the high school that I went to. And I could walk to her house for lunch and I would get a gourmet lunch. And I mean, and this was every day. Uh, and it was, well, and she had very arthritic hands. So, I mean, you have to understand what she was doing was a great sacrifice to herself. I didn't appreciate it as much then as I do now. But she would make pancakes, but she would put fruit in the pancakes. Now you have to understand, I never grew up with fruit in the pancakes, but I was eating designer pancakes at our house.
Welcome to our cooking conversation, our talk with my dads or important people in my life. This is Bob Holder, my father-in-law, I should say. I just wanted to have conversations, like to connect with family members and to connect through food. So I have a few questions. Do you recall how you learned to cook?
Yeah, 2 ways. So my mother felt I should be very independent. So I learned to cook for her. I learned to sew buttons, I learned to wash clothes. So she basically wanted me to be independent so that I didn't need a wife.
Mm.
And, I mean, that's the way I was trained. My father was also a scoutmaster, a long time scoutmaster. So he did a lot of outdoor cooking over the fire, over the coals, over wood. And I learned a lot from him. I could cook enough in the house, to scramble some eggs or fry some eggs, make some bacon and toast. I wouldn't starve. The fun cooking was outdoors and we're cooking ribs or steak or duck, chicken, or whatever we could get our hands on. We also cooked vegetables out. We also would do things in the scouts. I was in the scouts with my father, who was my scoutmaster. We had a dish we make that I kind of like. We cook leaves of cabbage, and inside that you put onions, carrots, potatoes, sliced vegetables, whatever you like. You put a hamburger, and you seal the whole thing up in tinfoil, and you basically baked it, cooked it on coals,
Mhm.
literally directly on the coals.
Oh, wow.
And then when you took it off, it was done. You ate everything inside. Sometimes you wouldn't eat the outside leaves of the cabbage if they got a little burnt. But yeah, so all that stuff was self-contained
Mm,
in a big, if you could imagine a big, tightly sealed tinfoil.
mm.
That's one of the things I remember. I remember my dad, and I didn't help, but I remember digging a hole. He dug a hole. We dug a hole. He dug, and we cooked beans in the ground. So there was a style where you put a fire in a hole. The fire burned down, put the food in like a Dutch oven. You put it on top of the remaining heat and you covered it up and it cooked because the earth basically contained the heat. So you heated up the earth and then it continued to cook. That didn't turn out to, but it was still an experience to deal with. We also we did a lot of camping
Mm.
and scouts and, I cooked in reflector ovens. I remember cooking in a reflector oven. I remember starting a fire with flint and steel. So as the scouts, we had to do that. So we made some biscuits in a reflector oven or something, and they were edible. We didn't die from eating them.
A
But
reflector oven, what's that?
okay, a reflector oven in scouting terms.
Mhm.
If you made it from scratch, it involved getting branches and
Mm,
wrapping those branches in tinfoil so that you created a basically a 5-sided structure, like a cube, but
mm,
one side was open. Your food went inside this cube, and then you had a fire outside, and the heat from the fire reflected in the oven and cooked the food.
mm.
It's very similar to like a Fuego fire insert in your fireplace, which is really a metal box. And what happens is you heat that fire. They call it conductive heat or something, and
Mhm.
that air around it and blows it back out at you. Not exactly the same, but similar principle. So that's what we did with reflector ovens. So we cooked reflector oven. most of the cooking I did, particularly as an adult with at home family, and your husband included, did a lot of cooking on grills.
Mhm.
And my favorite grill style was a Weber. And I would take my children outside and I would teach them to handle fire, how to lay a fire, how to start a fire, most importantly, how to extinguish a fire.
Right, right, right.
So I thought, that was my way of doing stuff. And in the summer, we would go and cook. And if I could fit it on the grill, I could cook it. We'd figure it out. We cooked vegetables, we cooked meats. I remember cooking duck. I don't think I cooked a turkey because turkeys were kind of big, but certainly chicken, duck, salmon, other kinds of fish, corn, vegetables, ribs, of course, chops, steaks, roast.
Mm.
So that, I used to do a lot of that.
Wow. You said something earlier about your mom wanting you to be self-sufficient. Can you
Hmm.
say a little bit more about that?
Yeah. I don't remember doing a lot of dishwashing, but I did some. But I scrubbed floors, I cleaned house, I knew how to vacuum, I knew how to put a button on a shirt, I knew how to sew my pants if they got, the hems got ripped or something. Or I had to be self sufficient. And so that was the way I was raised. Well, and that's, mom did not want me to have somebody to do stuff for me like that. You get married for a different reason than having to have someone do those kinds of things. At
Mhm.
that time, you got to remember, well into my 70s, that um, things were definitely different at that time. The role of women were definitely different. It's evolved and progressed positively, I would think. But she wanted me to be able to do that. That was just her normal life skills.
What would you say are, 3 essential skills a new cook should learn?
Safety.
Mm.
First thing they need to do is safety. The stoves today are a lot better than they were when I grew up cooking on a gas stove. And a gas stove was, I prefer it. A lot of people prefer it. Well, I think is a more flexible and more controllable cooking environment in terms of adjusting heat and making changes.
Mhm.
Excuse me. But also, if you're dealing with the gas stove, you're dealing with gas. You got to make sure that pilot light is on because if you don't, you will wake up the next morning. Gas is a silent killer. So I think safety is important, even with the electric stoves. Knowing how to handle your equipment, knowing what it does, what not to do, is extremely important. Knowing that if you get a fire on the stove, particularly if you're frying things that are greasy like bacon or you're using some fats and oils, you don't put water on it. I never had to do that, but you need to know that. So I think safety is extremely important. You can burn up your house, kill yourself, kill your family, while all trying to do a good deed. So I think first you have to know what you do. What does the equipment do? The other thing I think you have to be able to follow directions, and meaning not only with the equipment, but when you start dealing with trying to cook and have anything that's edible, if you don't know what you're doing, find a recipe and follow it. You don't have to like it. You just need to follow it to get some sense of where you're going. Then you have to be creative and doctor. So meaning, I mean, I know you're a little bit about your cooking style. I know Pat's cooking style. Uh, Recipes are made to give us a base,
Mhm.
but good cooks deviate from that and they customize it to their clients, their families, or to their own taste. And that means adding or subtracting and experimenting. So in order to get a dish the way you really want it, takes a lot of time and patience because there's a lot of trial and error.
Mhm.
So yeah, you asked me what the three most essentials: safety, knowing how to read directions and follow them, and then creativity.
Yeah. Great. If you had to rate yourself on a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate your level of confidence, as a cook?
Yeah, 6 to 7,
Okay.
maybe. I mean, I've cooked for you. a little bit. I would rate myself a lot higher dealing with meats because
Okay.
that's where I'm comfortable. Did a lot of grilling. So, I mean, I understand when you're dealing with meats, how to season them.
Mhm.
For example, you cook a lot. I like lamb. I grew up eating a lot of lamb. Not everybody did. And I learned that kind of stuff from my father, who was a butcher in the army.
Mm.
So, World War II. So I learned to season lamb and watch him, and he would show me, or we'd go out and cook on the grill or stuff like that. So I learned a lot from him. Well, I learned like if you're going to do duck, whether you're doing it in the oven or on the grill, you can put onions and apples and stuff inside of it. Some of it helps with the grease. Some of it also helps with the flavor. I never really cooked a turkey. I'm not a big turkey person. My mother loved turkey, but to me, most turkeys are too dry unless you get the drumstick. I've cooked pieces and I've cooked whole chickens,
Mhm.
So uh, again, it depends on what you want to do. I like barbecue chicken. I like to put it on the grill. I like fried chicken, but it's not the healthiest of stuff. So I'm comfortable in the meat world, not so comfortable in the vegetable world. I mean, I boil it or you steam it, and hopefully it's in a bag that I can put in the microwave. I'm not a big vegetable person. I've gotten better since being married to Pat. But I'll eat more vegetables, but I had no problem, throwing something between two pieces of bread. It was meat and eating it. So, but yeah, I think overall I do okay. I'm not the most creative cook. I don't spend the time really fine tuning recipes. I'll
Mhm.
experiment with stuff and I like it okay. If I don't remember what I did for the next. So
Mm. Yeah, yeah, that's true. That happens to me too. Yeah. So what score would you give yourself as the um someone on the grill then?
probably 8 or 9
Okay.
people out there that are better. That doesn't relate to the cooking skills as much as does to the seasonings.
Okay.
Um, I know how to cook on a grill. I know what to look for when I'm cooking meats out there. And every once in a while, you blow it. It gets fired too hot or you leave something too long. But you know what to look for. You know when it's done. The problem most people have, particularly with meats, fowl and pork and fish, they overcook
Mhm.
because we're told we're not supposed to eat them undercooked because it's not good.
Mhm.
So we overcook them, and that's so they don't taste like it. So I'm
Yeah.
very comfortable outdoors, indoors. I do okay. There's certain things I like to cook indoors. uh, so it all depends.
So you mentioned seasoning. You know how to season. What would you say is your favorite season or herb or spice to use
It
on the grill?
depends on what you're doing. Uh, you know, Actually, I like some of the spices that I know you make, and I've had the opportunity to work with, particularly some of the jerk seasonings. Um,
Mhm.
I also like, what do they call it? They're Creole, what they call Creole season.
Right. Yeah.
I like those. But I ran across a pepper seasoning that we like. We can't find it in.
Mm.
I like salt. I like salt. Wife is not a big salt person. Pat's not a big salt person. I am. I like salt, pepper. Sometimes I'll take cooking Italian seasonings, like an Italian seasoning mix,
Mhm.
and put it on chicken and bake it.
Right. Yeah.
When I do lamb, typically it's going to be garlic, rosemary, thyme, salt,
Mhm.
pepper. And what I do is I pierce the lamb partially. I don't go all the way through. And you take the garlic that's cut up the clove. And I don't mince it. I just cut it, and I start stuffing it down there. And I have the fresh thyme. So I stuff it in there
Mhm.
and then cook it. Salt and pepper the outside, maybe basil. Sometimes you use in there.
Mm.
You might use jerk seasonings like yours. Pincy's makes a spice called bear. It's an African spice, which you may be familiar with.
Mhm.
And it's got a little bit of little tinge of heat to it, but it's a different flavor. And that works well on fish and pork. Actually, it works pretty well on anything. I use that sometimes.
Can you recall a time when you completely ruined a dish or a meal?
It was not too long ago.
Mm,
I'm not, I like spaghetti, but I'm used to the old country spaghetti or how my parents did spaghetti and meatballs.
mhm.
And the stuff was made generally from scratch. So the stuff you have today comes out of a jar or a can. It's okay, I'm not as fond of it. And so I was fooling around with it, trying to give it some punch. And I put a little sugar in. Well, it turned out to be not a little sugar, it's too much sugar.
Yeah.
Just trying to liven it up, give it some personality, and I would put things like in this canned stuff. I would put cayenne peppers in it or pepper flakes.
Mhm.
Um, some, like I mentioned, this Italian seasoning earlier. Sometimes I'll put that in there. Just to me, the stuff is so bland. So, if you're really going to make sauce, that's hard. It's pretty time consuming.
How would you say your culture has shaped, like the things that you cook or
Oh, definitely, definitely. I mean, I grew up in South Side Chicago, black neighborhood, black parents, and money was tight. So first of all, you weren't running around having prime rib and upper end steaks. I mean, that happened as the family progressed economically. But I remember a lot of stews, with potatoes and meat in them and peas and carrots. Not a big carrot fan, but you ate it. I think greens, for example, I've always liked greens, collard greens in particular, though I will eat kale and turnip greens. I think the use of things like hot sauce was very much prevalent in our neighborhoods. Part of the reason was to give the food flavor. I'm not a chitlin man. There are people who love chitlins. I just can't deal with them. My grandmother would grow food in the backyard, in her backyard. I remember rhubarb. I think she had tomatoes and some other things. And then I had another aunt who literally had fruit trees in her backyard. And we get some of the fruit. And sometimes she was an excellent cook. She could make pies and cakes and stuff. But we also would make ice cream, homemade ice cream. We were doing that once or twice. So, I think growing up, when you had to stretch a dollar and you're very dollar conscious, certainly it deals with your diet too. So you eat things that are less expensive,
Mhm.
you know, and I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I think we can eat healthy, less expensive things. We just don't.
Mhm.
A lot of Southern cooking, when you consider I grew up in Chicago, the Great Migration up the Mississippi into Chicago, coming out of Mississippi, out of Arkansas, out of Alabama. People brought their traditional foods and dishes. So we used to have soul food restaurants in Chicago. So yeah, I think culture definitely, definitely influences what you eat. Black folks were eating lobster when I was growing up, and there was a place down the south side, the south side of Chicago. It was White Shrimp House, and that's where you went to get your fried shrimp. I'm sure there were other places, but that was a pretty popular place. And you had Lib's Barbecue House, and you got your hot links and your rib tips and your ribs.
Have you had any major changes in your eating habits over the last, let's say 5, 10, 15 years?
Mhm.
And you mind sharing what some of those big
Uh,
changes are?
Consuming more vegetables, obviously, consuming more vegetables. I'm strictly, I was strictly a meat and potatoes kind of guy. Give me a slab of steak or beef or ham or something, potatoes, and I was good to go. Um, so I think, more of the peas, green beans, eating more vegetables like that um, was what that has been a big change. Probably more fruit, so a more balanced diet.
Mhm.
If I mean, breakfast for me was a bunch of eggs, some bacon and sausage, pancakes. waffles or toast or something. Not a lot of fruit stuff. Certainly not a lot of like bread or cereals that were good for your digestive system. If you had grits, then you loaded them with butter. That's the way it was. Where don't eat like that as much anymore. Got more grain stuff, oatmeals, well, rice sometimes. Like rice. Too much rice.
Rice is good. I like
Rice
rice.
is good.
There's a story that I love that you used to tell is of your grandmother and how she would cook for you. You might share. I just love that story of how she would cook for you for lunch.
Yes. Well, grandmother, my mother's side, well, lived about 3 blocks from the high school that I went to. And I could walk to her house for lunch and I would get a gourmet lunch. And I mean, and this was every day. Um, and it was, well, and she had very arthritic hands. So, I mean, you have to understand what she was doing was a great sacrifice to herself. I didn't appreciate it as much then as I do now. But she would make pancakes, but she would put fruit in the pancakes. Now you have to understand, I never grew up with fruit in the pancakes, but I was eating designer pancakes at our house. She would make, she made a grilled cheese sandwich. And you got to remember, I'm a high school kid and I'm probably 6 feet, 6'1" at the time. I ate everything in sight. She'd have to make 2 or 3 of them. But the grilled cheese was on homemade bread. My grandmother made homemade bread.
Wow.
And it was an egg bread that she made. So, it was none of this silver cup, wholesome, butter cup, whatever the fancy breads were. My bread was homemade. And it was, so it was that kind of stuff. She used to make a thing called an apple dumpling. And people may know what an apple dumpling is. It's one way to describe it is a individual apple pie, but this is not the Hostess apple pie you see in the store. And when we were growing up, they used to cost a nickel, and they came in they looked like a fried pie. My dad used to make fried pies. I never did that, but they look like a fried pie. They look like a half moon shape. Now they have a little pies, and they're in little tin, aluminum foil tin. But my grandmother would make the dough from scratch, and she would make it very short. Now, as a cook, you know what I mean when I say it's made very short. Therefore, it's very rich. And she would take an apple. She would peel the outside of the apple, and she would core the apple. And in the core of the apple, she would put sugar, brown sugar, raisins, stuff like that. Not quite sure what she did with the outside, but you would then put the apple in the dough. You seal up the dough and you bake it in the oven. And it comes out, and you've got all this wonderful juice and syrup from the sugars and the raisins and the apple inside this thing. It's this crispy outside. And she would make a thing called rock sauce, which is some kind of lemon and butter concoction that we would pour on the top of it.
Oh, wow.
That would be my dessert.
I dessert for lunch?
For lunch. My grandmother made rolls. She made them by hand from scratch. Again, flour, sifting, not sure all what she did. I think my cousin may have the recipe. And when she made them, either she had to hide it from us, or members of the family, or she had to make enough to give everybody an adequate supply. And typically she would make these for holidays, like Thanksgiving and Christmas. And again, she said these arthritic hands. So this was no small feat for her. And the thing that she liked to put on, and again, you may not track this. A lot of people may not track with it. But there used to be a butter called Daisy Bran. And it was a whipped butter, and it looked white. But it was just, and these rolls were made for Daisy Bran butter. And I just remember that. I haven't seen Daisy Brand in years, but it was a whipped butter and the white whipped butter. And I'm not sure if it was salted or lightly salted. And I never used Daisy Brand on like waffles or pancakes or toast,
Ah.
always with these rolls. So that was the kind of way grandmother did things. And she did pies and other things, but I remember like I say, the apple dumplings. I remember the homemade bread. I remember the fruited things, the pancakes with fruit in it, so yeah.
Yeah. I love that story because I could just imagine you going over to your grandmother for
Well,
gourmet lunch.
well, yeah, I would come back to school. Now the high school cafeteria at that time, lunch was a quarter. It's probably $5 now. Lunch was a quarter and it was, slop on the plate,
Mm.
you know, and, I kind of laughed. What did y'all have to eat? Well, you know, so, yeah, I remember that. She was just, I grew up with my grandmother. I mean, we literally shared a room when I was a very young child. So, yeah, I mean, that's kind of it. What
Yeah.
else you got?
Okay, so if you had a chance to travel back in time, what advice would you give to your younger cooking self?
Learn the recipes.
Mm.
My mother made spinach patties, and the recipe is lost. And I've had spinach patties, and I like spinach patties. They're not the same as hers.
Mm.
And I've had good ones. I've had good ones. Uh, get the recipes, write them down, even if it's a dab of this and a pinch of that. Make sure you get them. I never, I watched her make them, but I know there was spinach in them. And she went from, I don't think she didn't use frozen spinach. She didn't use canned spinach. I think she used fresh spinach. There was spinach, there was onion in it, egg, when they were fried. So learn, anybody who's coming up, if your parents or a family member has a dish you really like, get them to write it down for them, and better yet, help them make it so you know what goes into it and what it's supposed to look like at
Mhm.
various stages. Learn the family recipes. If you have a good cook in the family, learn those recipes.